Welcome to the Secure CIO, the podcast for technology executives who are tasked with hiring and retaining great cybersecurity leaders. Join best-selling author Claire Pales together with industry thought leaders as they answer your questions about sourcing the right leaders, building cybersecurity teams, candidate selection, salaries, skills, and more.
Hello and welcome to the Secure CIO podcast. I'm Claire Pales and today's guest is Carolyn Wong. Carolyn is the Chief Security Strategist at Cobalt.io. Carolyn's practical information security knowledge stems from broad experience as a Cigital consultant, a Symantec product manager, and her day-to-day leadership roles at both eBay and Zynga. Carolyn is a well-known thought leader on the topic of security metrics and has been featured at industry conferences including RSA in USA and Europe, OWASP, AppSec, B-Sides, All Day DevOps, and Shift AppSec. Carolyn holds positions on multiple industry advisory boards, including the North American Advisory Council for ICS Squared and the RSA Conference Advisory Board. Carolyn is the author of the popular textbook Security Metrics, A Beginner's Guide, published by McGraw-Hill. She is a graduate from UC Berkeley with a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering and Computer Sciences, and she also holds a certificate in Finance and Accounting from Stanford University Graduate Business School. Thanks so much, Carolyn, for joining us today.
Claire, it is my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So we've heard a little bit about you in your bio, but tell me a bit about how you got into leadership and what drove you also to take on these industry body roles in cyber, such as the ICS Squared and the RSA conference roles.
Sure. So to me, what has been interesting about leadership is that as an individual contributor, or actually as I like to refer to it as a maker, I feel like there's somewhat of a limit. Of course, there's a limit to the work that I can do, to the impact that I can have as one person. To me, leadership is so exciting because working with others allows me to expand that reach and expand that impact. And I had the opportunity to do so when I was at eBay. My first sort of tiptoe into management was to manage an internship program for the global information security team at eBay. And so that was the first time I was sort of looking through candidate resumes and talking to potential interns to see if they might be a fit. A lot of the stuff, frankly, that I do today, but it was a nice opportunity for me to get started because, of course, an internship is time bound. And so we were able to be specific about the projects. As far as the industry groups go, this to me is something that I'm extremely passionate about. As I have grown in my cybersecurity career, I've learned that the people in this industry are so critical, and it is so fascinating to me. And so for me to be a part of these groups, I feel like gives me an opportunity to influence the direction of the industry, particularly the way that we continue to grow new talent and how we share information amongst each other, those of us that have done things. And so I like that a lot about certain parts of the InfoSec cybersecurity industry, depending on which word you prefer to use, depending on what year you're talking in, perhaps. But yeah, I really like that there are parts of our industry that are so willing to share information because I think that's really important at this time.
You mentioned in there about sort of growing the skills and influencing the industry. I mean, there's a lot of talk at the moment around our industry having a skills crisis. What are your thoughts on this? And do you think that it will impact in-house teams, but also security vendors?
So I think it's absolutely real. One of the things that I do in my current role is I have the opportunity to host industry networking dinners, typically for technology leaders and security leaders. And it's so much fun for me. We gather, a dozen, usually less than 24 folks over a great dinner, and we talk. And inevitably, the topic of hiring comes up. And there are I would say at a typical one of these dinner tables, 75% of the attendees are either security or development leaders with open headcount on their teams to fill, where they're looking for information security skills. And everyone expresses challenges in trying to accomplish this, because the reality is, if you go to sort of the global talent pool and you're looking for someone who, for example, has 5 years of experience in application security, the individuals who match that particular criteria are going to be quite limited. And most likely, those individuals, what I've observed, already have jobs. In fact, already have great jobs. And so the role of either a hiring manager or maybe a recruiter who's working in security is actually to poach these people from their existing jobs. And then, you spend the next, whatever it is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, hoping that they don't leave to go somewhere else, because folks are in such high demand. I mean, you look at LinkedIn profiles and resumes, and you see folks having had very short periods of time at different companies. And it kind of, sometimes it's like it doesn't even matter, because the skills are in such high demand.
Yeah, and I think because of that, a lot of organisations are looking at how they can supplement their security in-house team, or lack thereof. Given your years of experience in different types of organisations, what's your opinion on what is core that needs to be kept in-house, and what could you outsource if that was your only option?
Yes. So this, to me, is such an interesting question, that of organizational development, particularly for a security function. The first thing to consider is the broader organization's mission. If it's a for-profit business, how does that business make money? Regardless of whether it's a for-profit business or not, maybe it's a nonprofit, maybe it's a government entity. These have missions. So what is critical, what is important to that organization? That, to me, is really the first way to think about how to begin structuring a security team. To me, very broadly speaking, there are two large components of any organization that need to be secured. One is the technology and one is the people. And, to start out with, you have to kind of figure out, who can you begin with in-house? What sorts of skills are possible, and what sorts of reach do you need to have? Now, for example, you may have sort of a core team, and if that team has, the right type of budget, then that team could potentially outsource a majority of the work. The way that I think about the work is in 3 categories. One category is to build something, to take nothing and then to create a process. The second category of work is to run something. And the third category of work is to innovate and figure out what is the next thing that we should build. And I think that for most security organizations, well, it really just depends. On one hand, maybe the core security team is the most interested in building and innovating, in which case what you might outsource would be the running, just operating. On the other hand, the team may or may not have specific skills or expertise in order to do the building or the innovating, in which case they might outsource that component to, for example, a consulting firm, or in the current case of my company that I currently work for, Cobalt.io, what we do is we provide manual pen test services. So if folks are, the core team doesn't have particular technical security testing skills, then that's something that you might outsource. So I think there's all these different ways of looking at it. But I think if organizations can think to themselves, okay, what needs to be built, what needs to be run, what needs to be innovated, and then kind of compares that to, well, what are the strengths of the core team that we have? What are the skills that we have? And what are the skills that we don't? And that can be one way of looking at it.
Just another question, just based on a few things that you just said. You mentioned a couple of times this sort of idea of a core team. Do you think every organisation needs a core security team, or are there some businesses that could survive without a team at all and outsource everything?
Yeah, I don't think every business needs a core security team. My fundamental learning ground in the industry happened to be at eBay, which is a ginormous international company. At the time, it must have had 24 subsidiaries, something along the lines of 20 or 30,000 employees. I mean, we're talking like a really major enterprise.
Yeah.
An organization at that level, yes, you need to have a security team. But so many organizations are not at that level, and they don't necessarily. I see more mature organizations, larger organizations, more established organizations who have gotten to a point where, yes, it makes sense to have a core security team, but there are tons of organizations for which maybe the person doing security is actually a CIO or a vice president of engineering or a director of DevOps. And security is one of the many things that this person does. And maybe a little bit ironically, when you're looking at the type of organization where security is managed by somebody who, for example, a CIO, a CTO, a director of engineering, a vice president of engineering, if that person is running, for example, engineering and security, you actually have natural alignment. And there's something really great about that. If you look at organizations that have separate security teams, there actually has to be an intentional effort for the security and the development teams to work together. So in some ways, it's a little bit ironic, which is that as organizations specialize, they have to make an effort to come together. But before they're ready to specialize, they're already together because that's just how they are.
It's a bit more small business mentality and a bit more, everybody rolls their sleeves up, I suppose.
Exactly.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about this new DevSecOps movement. And I know DevSecOps can be labelled in a number of ways, but I'm going to use that term for simplicity. What are some of the challenges that organisations are facing in hiring and retaining staff in this particular space?
Sure. So from what I've observed, one of the challenges having to do with DevSecOps is actually cultural and organizational. If I take a step back and, people use all sorts of different words to refer to this movement, DevOps, DevSecOps. Some people say SecDevOps, whatever term you want to use, fine. Fine with me. But let's take Dev and Ops, for example. If an organization is changing from historically a development team and an operations team who maybe didn't get along because they didn't understand each other, because they had different perspectives and maybe conflicting agendas, then to transform that organization to a DevOps culture and methodology is going to be a challenge because there's a history of the teams not getting along. Something like that is not going to change overnight. You add security into the mix, and it's just like another party that may or may not get along with the others. So I think that can be a challenge. The organizations that manage to escape that are the ones who start out sort of born in DevSecOps, if you will. A brand new organization, or maybe a brand new part of another organization that started out that way to begin with. So I don't think it's impossible to overcome the cultural and, frankly, political barriers that are involved in transforming a culture where potentially two or more teams didn't really get along so well to, one where they are working more effectively together. I don't think that's impossible, but it's certainly easier to do that if it's sort of set up that way from the start.
I think most people would agree that anyone who starts something from the ground up has that opportunity to take the lessons learned from other organisations who have been there before. And or while this is a relatively new space, I'm sure there are some businesses who have learned hard lessons through this process of building such teams.
Yes, absolutely. I think that, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it was not so easy to start a tech company because there were private data centers and you needed, engineering teams. And today, you still need engineering teams, but there's an awful lot of the IT infrastructure that can be outsourced and just spun up very rapidly in the cloud. And there are all sorts of new organizations that are popping up right out of that. And so I think in some ways, those organizations do have an advantage. And it's that they can move quickly and get started in a certain way that's different from an existing established organization that's trying to sort of make a drastic turn.
I mean, talking of sort of that technical side of things, you've made that transition from being a technical expert into a leader. For you, was that something that you wanted to do and it was your doing, or did someone else see leadership in you and think this would be a great opportunity for Carolyn, to sort of evolve out of the lever pulling and into the leadership space?
When I graduated from university with my freshly minted computer science degree, I was choosing between 3 jobs. One opportunity was to be a DBA at a big Silicon Valley company. Another, which I eventually chose, was the InfoSec opportunity at eBay. And the third was sort of a jack of all trades generalist at a graphics startup. And, I ended up going into InfoSec, and then I met a mentor who gave me a huge opportunity. When Dave Cullinane joined eBay as the CISO, he had come from Washington Mutual Bank in around, I want to say it was 2007 or so. He said to me, he basically asked me what I wanted to do in my life. I was 23 years old at the time. I was very new to information security. And Dave said to me, Caroline, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said to him, with all of the confidence of a new college grad who has very little experience, I said to him, well, one day I'd like to be the CEO of a small to medium-sized company. And he said to me, okay, right now, I would really like for you to report directly to me, because I had been reporting to a manager who reported to Dave. Mm-hmm. He said, I'd like you to report directly to me and be the chief of staff for the global information security team.
Wow.
And I sort of said, I was actually a little bit resistant at first. I said, Dave, I have only been in this industry for a very short period of time. And he said to me, don't worry. I know everything that we need to know, and I know that you know how to get things done. And so at that time, I couldn't figure out, as a relatively young person at the start of my career, I couldn't figure out what was in it for Dave.
Yeah.
And now, of course, I get it, right? A great leader sees potential in people that they don't even see in themselves.
Yes.
And then a great leader lays out that path to allow that person to grow. And then, of course, if a person's team is great, that leader is great. And I understand that now, but at the time, I didn't get it. But Dave really saw something in me that I didn't quite see in myself. And that has made a tremendous difference for my career.
What a huge opportunity he gave to you, and the foresight that he had in seeing the potential that you had. And I think that that's a skill in itself. And many senior leaders are looking to their technical staff and to their, I guess, younger players What sort of traits do you think they'd be looking for? I mean, what advice would you give to leaders now that you've been through that process yourself for them to support their more technical staff to grow into leaders?
One thing is actually, and this is going to sound almost a bit contradictory, I think that in some organizations, the only way up might appear to be in management.
Yeah.
I think that the first question a leader needs to ask of the team member is, do you want to be a manager or do you want to be a maker? For example, do you want to work with the technology or do you want to support the team that takes care of the technology? Do you want to work with the customer or do you want to support the team that works with the customer? Because I think that there is a lot to be said for a maker role, an individual contributor role. That being said, if somebody wants to be so that's a big question to ask, and that's also a big thing to evaluate. So if an individual is very technically good at something, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be amazing at supporting a team of folks who are very good at executing. I believe that it's a skill set that can be learned, but it is distinctly different. For example, do you like doing performance reviews? And knowing that the team members who work for you, they may be like you, they may not be like you. They may be high performers, they may not be high performers. These are all the sorts of things that a great manager works with. And so I think one way is to really position the question to say, management is not the only way up. It's certainly possible to be a maker, an individual contributor, and to grow and progress in one's career. But I think either way, if somebody wants to demonstrate leadership, what they've got to show is that they can learn things quickly. And leaders in particular, there's another difference, which I think I certainly struggled with as I transitioned from a maker to a manager, which is, as a maker, if you're very good at being a maker, you're probably very productive. And then as you're transitioning to being a manager, the way that you think changes from, okay, what are, for example, the 10 or 20 tasks that I need to achieve today? And you're thinking about a longer term horizon. What does my team need to accomplish in the next 12 to 18 months? And how do I measure their progress? And how do I set them up for success? And in a given day, as a person who's transitioning from a maker to a manager, you might actually feel not very productive. You may have actually written far fewer emails or far less code than you did as a maker. And that's something that, if you want to be a people manager, you do have to learn how to move past that. So that, for me personally, was something that I found to be a challenge, but also an exciting opportunity. In order to be whatever you're going to be tomorrow, you have to let go of who you are today. And I think that some people are more up for the change than others.
I think you make some incredibly important points in your response to that question, because leadership is not just about managing people. And I think you're right, people who are makers can still be leaders, but their day-to-day job certainly changes as soon as they start to take on those leadership responsibilities, or those leadership responsibilities are cast upon them.
Yes.
I want to talk a little bit about specifically around team building and team development. And what role does diversity play for you when you're building teams, or when you're looking at sort of an operating model or a sourcing model? Do you think that there's particular demographics out there or styles of people who fit well into the security industry, or who become very good security leaders?
So this is such an interesting question. And I think I know where you're coming from. The word diversity has so many tones to it. But I think what's important to discuss is, how do you build a team? And more specifically, how do you match potential candidates with jobs that need to be filled. That is a problem that our industry is really struggling to figure out. And I actually have made a joke a couple of times now, and I'll share it with you, that what we need is like Tinder for cybersecurity job applicants and cybersecurity hiring managers, because it's a very challenging match to make. Hiring managers often find themselves in a position where they may frankly struggle to write a job description.
Yes.
And that's because they're trying to figure out, what should this person do, there is an approach. Okay, you go online, you look at other job descriptions, you copy and paste the parts that you like, and you sort of customize something, and that's fine. But then what some hiring managers find themselves doing, because they're themselves totally overloaded with work, that is, of course, why they're trying to hire someone or many people for their team anyway, they don't have time, they don't make the time to go out and source candidates. And so maybe in some cases, they pass that, copy and paste a job description over to a recruiter.
Yeah.
And then the recruiter goes through a typical traditional pattern matching situation. And they look for example, the individual who's done application security for 5 years. Well, I'll tell you what, a lot of the people who've done application security for 5 years all sort of look the same-ish, right? Yeah. And so the reality, of course, is that the hiring manager needs someone to perform some sort of work, whether that be strategic or operational work. And it might be convenient to have someone who's done AppSec for 5 years, but it might not. It actually might be so inconvenient to look for someone with that particular checkbox on their resume, because there's so few people out there. And if you bring that person on board, they're in such high demand that who knows where they're headed tomorrow. It's more effective, I think, for a hiring manager to think really deeply and thoughtfully about, what is this person going to be doing? And if they can then write that down. And that's not an easy thing to do. Yeah. But if you can take any role, and I think this is particularly important in cybersecurity right now because we have this massive talent shortage, and you can break it down into the parts, and then you can look for people who can do those things. It doesn't have to be, find me the candidate with 5 years of application security experience. It can be, find me the candidate who's really good at A and B and C.
Yeah.
And finding those transferable skills and finding folks who can learn quickly. That to me can actually be more effective and can help people sort of do this matching, which is very difficult to do today.
And you also, I think, end up with far more diverse teams because, as you said, there are many people out there who have very similar experience. And if you go out there looking for an AppSec person who has 5 years experience, you could end up with a whole team of them. And that doesn't bring diversity. But if you seriously write down what they're going to be doing each day and their number of years experience, while you need some, if the actual number doesn't dictate who you hire, then it could be that you bring in someone who has far broader experience than you imagined that you needed, or far narrower, and that helps to create diversity, diversity of thought for a starting point.
Absolutely. I think that what I've observed anecdotally is that cybersecurity hiring managers who take matters into their own hands and choose to create space to really thoughtfully write job descriptions, and frankly, to spend a lot of time going out and sourcing candidates themselves, I think that those folks are more likely to end up with diverse teams because the great candidates that they find come from all sorts of different places. Now, of course, for some organizations, there are different limiting factors. At our organization, for example, we used to be a very San Francisco-based company. And then we realized that in order to find the best talent in the world, we needed to think very differently. And so we've opened an international office in Berlin. We expect to open another international office in Asia Pacific in the year 2020. Yeah. And we have a number of employees working in all sorts of locations all over the world. I myself work in Portland, Oregon. I've got a colleague who works out of Kazakhstan. I've got a colleague who works out of New Zealand. And so we're just really all over the place. And we've structured the way that we work and the way that we manage our teams around that. And it is super different than if everyone is physically co-located together. And some organizations do have that requirement, so not everyone has that sort of flexibility. But I think that today, if an organization can consider being flexible, that also really opens up the pool of potential candidates.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the world has completely changed, and certainly from a security perspective, remote working has its pros and its cons, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that one of the questions that's come up is actually, does a particular individual know how to work well remotely? Organizations may have trouble trusting employees, to which I say, look, if you don't trust someone to work for you properly because you can't physically see them sitting in the seat next to you, then should you even trust them enough to hire them in the first place? And sometimes an individual doesn't have the know-how, and needs to be provided with some guidelines. Hey, you need to be responsive, and here are some SLAs for your responsiveness. When you do calls, they need to be video calls. There are all these different ways of working, and some of them should be taught and can be learned. But fundamentally, I think what has to be in place is trust. If you don't trust someone to do their job, it's not going to work out, regardless of whether they're sitting next to you or if they're on the other side of the planet.
We've talked a little bit about graduates, and you mentioned just a few moments ago about a model in an organisation where you can find some really smart people straight out of the gates of university, and while you can pay them a small amount, they will deliver huge amounts of value to your organisation. And I guess in response to that, the organisation is giving them valuable experience that they may not get anywhere else. But talking about the salary specifically, what have you noticed about salaries? And I guess I'm interested in America, because here in Australia, security salaries have just shot up exponentially over the last couple of years. And, the demands that people can make in terms of salary and benefits and bonuses have really started to come into question, because they're so high now, not just at leadership levels, but at the maker level as well. What have you seen in America? Have you seen something similar to that?
Yes, it is a challenge. Security leadership in the United States is expensive.
Yeah.
And an organization really has to decide if it's appropriate to spend that much. A lot of organizations, I think, find themselves in a position where they're putting together a job description. Here's a security leader we want for the organization, and maybe they're going through some sort of, routine compensation analysis, and then they speak to candidates and they find one or two amazing candidates that they're very interested in. And then they ask about their compensation expectations, and it's like, whoa. So I think it's always important, first of all, to have compensation expectations discussed at the front of the conversation, just so that nobody's wasting anyone else's time. I think it's also important for a hiring manager to set that expectation with the organization to say, look, if this is an investment we want to make and this is how we want to go about it, it's going to be significant. So I think that puts many organizations in a position where they may actually evaluate the effectiveness for that particular organization at that level of maturity in terms of either hiring someone full-time or outsourcing pieces of it. For example, there are organizations that will offer, jokingly, rent a CISO type of services. But whatever type of security project or work needs to be done, there's probably a way to outsource it. And so I think that depending on what the organization is trying to achieve by making a security hire, it's worth evaluating the different options, because what's going to work best may not be obvious at first.
One of the last questions I like to ask of all my guests on the show is, what do you wish you had have known when you first started building teams that you know now? So when you started out as a leader, what sort of wise experience or knowledge do you wish you could have known back then?
So, two things. One thing is that not everyone is like me. And this is super obvious now that I know it. But of course, when I started out managing people, I expected that they would work similarly to the way that I work. And of course, everyone works differently. And so I had to learn, first of all, that everyone works differently. And secondly, how to be effective in my work relationships with people that work differently from the way that I do. And then in connection with that, I also know now that I didn't know before that as a leader, it is absolutely critical to set expectations. If expectations are set and metrics are designed in a measurable way, then you can actually evaluate progress. You can actually evaluate performance. You can say, did this person meet expectations with their work performance? Did they exceed expectations? Did they fail to meet expectations? But if you haven't set the expectations in the first place, then the rest of it is much more difficult to get your arms around. I think that if a leader is able to effectively set expectations with their team, then that puts everyone in a position where they can be successful because the team knows what they're trying to accomplish, and the leader can ask questions like, what's getting in the way of you meeting these expectations? How can I support you? Is there something that you lack? Do you need tools? Do you need, the help of another team? Do you need to build a particular skill set? And so, that was one that I think that being very specific about defining expectations and writing those things down and over communicating them cannot be underestimated.
I think I could not agree more. I honestly think doing that hard thinking up front and making sure that you're clear on as a leader, you're clear on what you expect of your team and what you're planning to deliver means everybody can just go away and do their jobs. And as you say, you've got something to measure against. And that's key, I think, to being a great leader and running an effective team. Carolyn, thank you so much. I've really, really enjoyed chatting with you today. And some of your responses have really piqued my interest around questions that I want to ask some other guests now. So I'm really grateful for your time. Where can people find you and find out more about you?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. Please connect with me. Please chat. I love to talk about all things people and security related. Thank you, Claire, so much for having me today. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks very much. That's all we have time for today. Thanks so much for listening. For more information on all our guests, check out the show notes at thesecurecio.com, where you can also find more information on the Secure CIO framework and sign up for my newsletter. If you loved the show, please subscribe to the podcast and feel free to leave me a 5-star rating. I'll see you next week.